Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to join you today, and I especially want to thank Director Elizabeth Francis, the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities Board, the Rhode Island Congressional Delegation, and of course, our inspiring 2022 Celebration of the Humanities honorees. Congratulations. There are a few phrases I have to be careful about when I talk about polarization, depolarization, and how we move through these dangerously divided times with our civic health intact. One of those phrases is common ground. The thing is, I know how that sounds. I cringe when it comes up too casually in a panel discussion or a heal the world to-do list, or even a question I'm asked in an interview about my book. Let's all come together and find common ground. I mean, it's hopeful, but in this world, in this cacophony, with these high stakes on so many big issues, I don't kid myself that appeals to common ground sound naive or ignorant or worse. I would like to know how you propose to find common ground with people who are okay with 18-year-olds buying assault weapons. A former colleague tweeted me days after the mass shooting of children in Uvalde, Texas. People think that finding common ground is about finding total agreement or hasty solutions. It isn't. They worry that finding what's shared means losing what's theirs, the power of their stories and their values to improve their lives and their world. But it doesn't. To pursue what ties us together is to resist what pulls us apart. It's a barrier to dysfunction, a launchpad to understanding and innovation, and the critical animating spirit of our civics. So it's time we stop cringing and start acting. It's time to give the search for common ground the credit it's due and give our fractured communities the benefit of its practice. And what a way to do it, Rhode Island. To hail common ground for a place that, geographically at least, has more of it than most. You've got 1,061 people here per square mile, second only to New Jersey in population density. Your ground is already pretty common. But where it isn't, with all the reckonings with your history, with your changing, challenged communities, and with all the diverse stories, perspectives, and awesome civic power that surrounds you, I'm going to show you how to find common ground anyways, and let it unlock some new ways through. But first, let's get back to that tweet, and get honest about where finding common ground seems like it's asking us not just to embrace a fantasy, but also to deny what feels like an unavoidable reality. I want to know how you propose to find common ground with people who are okay with 18-year-olds buying assault weapons, with people who want to take away my guns, take away my health, take away my rights. Drop in whatever issue you'd like, from whichever direction you'd like. How do you propose to find common ground with people I want nothing to do with? There are three tendencies in human behavior that do more than most to pull us apart. I call them sorting, othering, and siloing. Sorting, the tendency to want to be around people who are like us, especially in times of stress, fear, and anxiety. Othering, the tendency to put distance between ourselves and those we deem too different, when too different, social science has shown us, can mean barely different at all. Siloing, the tendency to hear about the world out there from voices that affirm the world in here. A tendency that's so much easier when you can friend and unfriend with ease. May the bridges I burn light my way, goes a quote that's been making the rounds online. Added up, sorting, othering, and siloing are the SOS, the call for help. It's tough to work against our own programming. So it's worth asking, how can we find common ground if it's in our nature to divide? because it's also in our nature to connect. I run a workshop to help people build and flex the most depolarizing muscle we each have, our own curiosity. In one exercise, everyone breaks off into pairs, and people take turns asking each other question after question about the other person without being allowed to interrupt or respond in any way. And every time I've done this, everywhere from Florida to California to Ohio, someone has raised their hand when I ask what was hard about the exercise and said a version of the same thing. It was so tough, they say, not to tell them that I went to that school, that I also love that show, that their story about X reminded me about my story about Y. Not, in other words, to point out immediately and happily what they shared. We know that finding common ground matters because we come pre-equipped with the ability and the craving to do it, and we do it all the time. It's built into the mechanics of so much of our regular, everyday conversation, this discovery. Whether we're meeting a stranger or an old friend, whether we rant about the traffic or spark story after story from each other about the sports we love, the shows we watch, the things that worry us, a lot of the time it starts with discovery and moves toward connection. Even when the gap is really wide, this built-in common ground radar of ours leaves a mark. According to a study of 515 other studies, chatting in person with someone different from you, someone from your outgroup, reduces prejudice toward that group 94% of the time. This is such good news for the humanities, our cultural feast of knowledge and exploration that at its heart is all about human expression. A robust output of the humanities doesn't want a world so divided it's blinded, a world that shuts down and shuts up. The humanities demand what civic health demands, a world that can open its eyes ever wider to discover more of the complex truth of who we are. For that, we know we need to spark something else that seems elusive: civic engagement. Can that be about discovery too? When I think of engagement, I think of Captain Picard of the USS Enterprise. I used to watch Star Trek: The Next Generation obsessively as a kid. "Engage," he'd say, often at the end of an episode when one adventure was done and it was time for another. Engage meant revving up the starship's impulse drive and heading to something new. Across divides, that's not quite how we look at engaging each other. Instead, it's closer to something out of the mind of Providence's own H.P. Lovecraft, the writer of science, fantasy, and horror fiction. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear, Lovecraft wrote, is fear of the unknown. But if only the fear we have of each other were a fear of the unknown. Much of the time, what keeps us unengaged, running for the exits, is believing that we do know very well what other people think and why. 54% of Americans say other Americans pose the largest threat to this country. 19% of Americans have gone through depression or anxiety because of partisan divisiveness. And 77% say they have few or no friends from the other side. The bigger problem, in other words, it's not that we're too afraid. It's that we're too certain. Certainty is the arch-villain of curiosity. When we think we know, we don't think to ask, or to give ourselves the opportunity to discover common ground, or much of anything else. We think we know other people's motives when we don't. They think they know our motives when they don't. And another bit of subtext becomes clear. How do you propose to find common ground with total monsters? Now, fear, like certainty, is useful. It protects us from danger, but it shuts down discovery. You can't wonder about something you think is out to get you. When we believe too much that we are nothing like each other, have nothing to learn from each other, and might even be out to harm each other, our civic pulse slows way down. There are people who are so consumed by hate that they are worth fearing. But are there as many of them as you think? Don't waste your fears on anything but danger, goes one wise quip. I take it further. Don't waste your certainty on anything but truth. To be clear, the way to secure our civic health amid all this othering is not to turn down the complexity of what makes us different. We can't pretend we're the same when we're not, or that we agree when we don't. Instead, it's to turn up the complexity of what makes us who we are. To have a hope of finding common ground, we have to reveal our ground and let others reveal theirs. How? Try this. Instead of asking people why they believe what they believe, asking for their reasons, ask instead how they came to believe what they believe, asking for their experiences. And ask yourself, too. Each of us happens to be the world's leading expert in our own story. The only one who can describe our path, because we were there every step of the way. Reveal the paths, and they'll reveal the intersections. This is how you find common ground naturally. To quote my Braver Angels colleague, Steve Saltwick, don't have an argument, take a walk. Few civic duties seem more obvious than casting a vote. And when I learned that a woman I'd recently met, Jessica, hadn't voted in the 2016 election, I wanted to know why. Or rather, I wanted to understand why. I could have asked her point blank, why'd you do it? And gotten her reasons, which would have gone right up against mine. But instead, I asked her to walk me down the path to her decision, and listened. And in my mind, I saw. I saw her growing up liberal in a conservative town, becoming more politically engaged, becoming disenchanted with the left, finding little to hang on to with the right. I saw her staring at her ballot in her farmhouse in Sherman County, Oregon, not being able to stomach voting for Clinton, not being able to stomach the thought of voting for Trump, not being able to stomach voting for some third-party candidate she didn't really care about. I saw her losing sleep and realizing she had just one choice. And I, who could never imagine not voting in a major election, saw that too. I saw her look at her ballot and leave that space blank. And I understood. I told her not that I agreed, but that I had spotted an intersection. I wouldn't want to cast a vote that didn't feel right by me either. But how do you propose to take a walk when you disagree on assault weapons and gun ownership, or election integrity and immigration? When you're sure and they're sure, and you're not just asking questions, when you're engaging the issue with your opposing perspective very much in play. How do you propose to find common ground when you just think they're wrong? At that point, your walk is going to be more of a hike, up a mountain with tough terrain, where the air gets thin fast, and you have to acclimate to the places you're pushing each other if you're going to stay in the conversation long enough to glean new insights. But how? Here is where you can use common ground to build resilience in a really important way. You make a base camp. Finding common ground is not about finding total agreement, but building the base camps that help you acclimate to each other's perspectives and climb higher. Finding common ground is not about rushing to solutions. It's about building the connections and fueling the discovery and capacity to make eventual solutions possible and keep you learning when it's hard. Roger Williams founded Rhode Island a quarter of a millennia ago as a pioneering, lively experiment in religious and political toleration. We've learned a whole lot since then about where those principles missed so many people for so long. But to make sure we don't slip into some new kind of blindness to each other, we have to keep learning about each other, with each other, despite our divisions, and especially when it's hard. Finding common ground has never been the end of the work. It's always had to be the beginning. How do you propose to find common ground with people I want nothing to do with people I don't want to understand? Because not understanding each other is no excuse for not taking care of each other. And we owe it to our communities, to our humanities, and to the full potential of our civics to marshal all the extraordinary things that we're capable of and try. Thank you.